Okay, so just to review, since it's been a while, the last time we talked a little bit about wanting to collect feedback from customers, and then that we needed to create some team alignment. I know this was like a couple lectures ago because we had gone down the path of doing the exercises. And then we also talked about how to create a product roadmap, and that was the exercise that you all did, so that you have a better understanding now, hopefully, of how to match up business goals, and then from business goals, what are the features, and then we'll dig into how do you break down a feature into a story today, but we also put some metrics behind this, and that will become a little bit clearer when we do the metrics and analytics lecture later on, but at least now you've got the product roadmap, right? And then we also talked about picking features for an MVP. Come in.
I think the door's locked.
Oh. We're being polite. Okay. It's like in the 1950s where they like lock the door. Well, I guess I should leave it open in case. Oh, my God. So before we get into lecture today, Lab 3 is out. Does anybody have any questions on Lab 3? You're going to go out, you're going to do your mock-up, you're going to get feedback, and then you're going to get some feedback from interactions in person and then using Verify. So everyone's cool. Okay. Next Wednesday I won't have office hours because I'll be doing the idea summary, so if anybody absolutely needs to meet with me, let me know and we can schedule something for Thursday or some other time. I will have office hours on Tuesday though. Okay. And then, of course, there's been a few groups. I guess the rest of you are not participating in the Duke Startup Challenge, or you don't have your idea ready for the idea summary. But I know there's only a couple of groups in here, and there should be 9 groups, I think, if I counted right. So I'll put this up here one last time. You know, don't think of it as this monumental thing, right? Think of it as a chance to at least get your idea out there and to participate. So, you know, even if you don't have the idea summary session, think about applying. Think hard about applying. Because it will help you with your final project. Okay, so today we're going to dig into Today we're going to dig into product development a little bit more, and more on the product management side. And so one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to tear down a feature into stories, and that will be one of the exercises we do towards the end of class. We're also going to talk about how do you prioritize things when it comes to product development, right? A lot of times we want to build everything, or we think we need to build everything because there's so many either asks from the customer, or we just can't release a thing until it's a little bit more solid. So we'll go over some methods for doing that. And then we'll talk a little bit about how do you create a process so that you can ship consistently, and how that process is really going to evolve. And then we'll end with the lecture. I'm sorry, we'll end with an exercise. I'm still on call break. Okay. So you've seen this diagram many, many times, right? And we're still in this build and release phase where we're trying to figure out what's the feasibility of what we can build given the amount of resources we have, given the talent, given the time, given the money that we have. And like I said before, in the previous lecture that we did, I talked a little bit about the product roadmap. And you know, I laid this out. It's a bit of a simplistic model, and we dug in a little bit more. And some people asked, well, you know, where's the marketing plan here, or PR, or you know, other things? And you're absolutely right. You know, it would behoove you to add all of the various departments and all of their projects, and then to create a more cohesive timeline. But I just wanted you to get a start, you know, in this class to see what it looks like. So what we're going to talk about next is we dug in a little bit into what are the business goals and how do they fit into the features, but I want to do an even further breakdown. So, you know, we talked about mental models, and now we're going to kind of revisit that topic again so that hopefully this will come full circle from we created some mental models, we created some personas, we created some features, we figured out what our product is, and now we're going to kind of deconstruct it and go all the way back. And so what we're going to do at this stage is we're going to figure out what's the biggest business goal that we have when we launch our product. And then from there, what is the feature or the features that need to get created? And then we talked about how do you take a feature and break it down into stories so that you avoid things like scope creep. And really what we're going to do is we're going to need to start with a mental model. Who's our initial user segment that we're going after? So just to review, because I know it's been a few weeks since we talked about mental models, right? Remember, these were the people, we interviewed a number of user segments. Some of you have to go back and had to do some of that rework after the second lab. And then we collected feedback based on the interview and based off of giving them some paper prototypes, or sorry, not paper prototypes, but having the interviews and thinking about whether the problem that we were solving was the right problem. And then we combed for tasks, meaning we figured out what are the verbs that people are doing and how could we possibly create a product around it. And then we looked for patterns if we had multiple segments. And then based off of the patterns, we created some personas and some tasks. And then, of course, the tasks are what becomes stories, and those stories fit into features. So, just again to review, we had an example of a yoga instructor and a yoga studio owner, and there were 3 tasks that they all seemed to have in common, but there were sort of 2 outliers. So if we were to build anything in an initial prototype, we'd concentrate on sort of these 3 similar tasks. They teach yoga, they take attendance, and they need to get paid. So let's take a really simple example, right? You know, most of us, our business goal initially is that we've got to have some user acquisition, right? We've got to get customers more than just the early adopters that we've talked to. And so we want people to sign up, right? And so in order to sign up, well, we have to have a feature called a sign-up form, right? They're going to need to come to the site. We're going to want them to enter some information. Now, oftentimes, this is actually the biggest barrier to entry, right, to get people to actually sign up for your product. So let's assume we did good enough marketing that they're going to go and they're going to click sign up and they're going to want to sign up. Now, we have to put ourselves back into the mindset of the yoga studio owner, right? And so when we design the sign-up form, we have to think of that persona. And so they're going to say, so we're going to take a step back and we're going to figure out what's the story that we need to come up with in order to fill up this feature, right? What are some of the things that we need to think about when we're thinking about a yoga studio owner? So at a high level, right, they're going to say when they sign up, I'd like to sign up for a site that lets me take attendance, right? So we've had some marketing copy. We're maybe reiterating the value proposition of why they're signing up in the sign-up form. But that's not enough, right? Remember, we talked about scope creep. We can't just say, okay, here's a nice sign-up form, sign up for this product. We're going to need to dig a little bit deeper, right? So they might have something further that says, as a yoga studio owner, to sign up, the sign-up form needs to ask me for a valid email and a strong password, right? We don't want them to just like enter some really simple password like 1 through 8. We want them to actually give us something valuable, right? So there are some of these little design things that we need to think about as we are filling out our feature. And this is just a really simple example, but you can imagine handling things like error conditions and messaging, and the way that we do it needs to once again correlate with the type of user segment that we're going after. So what ends up happening is that the one story we had becomes multiple stories. So it looks something like this. We've got one story that says, as a yoga studio owner, to sign up, the sign-up form needs to ask me for a valid email and a strong password. Okay, we covered that. Second, as a yoga studio owner, if I entered an email address that is already in use, right, I need to receive a warning, right? How many times do people oftentimes enter the same username, same email, or whatever? Maybe they sign up for the site before. And the third is, as a studio owner, if I enter a password that isn't strong, I need to receive a warning, right? So these are all stories. These are all things that people are going to need to spend time building. Seems simplistic, right? But at the same time, this is what you have to do for every single feature that you're going to build. You need to think through all of the different use cases. Now, in this case, we sort of need to have all of these stories in order to ship, but we may have in the future some stories where everything starts to pile up, and then we realize we need to prioritize, right? We can't build everything. We have limited resources. So one of the things when we're thinking about prioritization is complexity. Okay? So, what do you think complexity is?
How many steps are required to achieve that particular task? The more steps required, the more complexity.
Okay, that's a fair definition.
Also, like how much mental energy you need to expend to figure out what you have to do.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So when you're building something, how much time do you have to learn something new? How much is it going to take?
Well, from the client side, I was thinking
No, let's think about it from our side in this case. So when I talk about complexity, I'm talking about it from our perspective, the people that are building.
Also, just how complex it is it to maintain that thing that you built?
Okay, that's good. Yep, how complex is it to maintain it? Okay. So it's the relative, you're also on the right track, it's the relative difficulty of building something, right? Do we not have the knowledge? Do we need to learn? Do we need to maintain this going forward? Or is it going to be a challenge even to get this thing out the door? So a lot of times what we don't factor in is we just say, oh yes, this can be built, and let's build it, rather than actually, is this the right approach? Is it going to be too complex? Maybe we want to deliberately leave some things out in the first iteration, right? So when we're trying to estimate and trying to create our product roadmap, one of the things we have to think about is what's the complexity involved? Not with the feature, but with each story. Okay? And what this is going to let us do, and you'll see when we talk about Sprintly, is it will actually let us get to some estimation of when the thing can be delivered. It's not perfect, right? People are obviously going to take more time or less time. People are going to get sick. There's going to be issues. But if we factor in the complexity, then we'll become better at estimating when something can be shipped. So the other part to this is that when we think about complexity, it actually helps us to develop a more consistent shipping time. Okay, and so what we're trying to do is we're trying to really come up with a process here for developing our product. Because remember, I've showed you that circle. We're going to keep going round and round, right? And as all of you remember escape velocity from the quiz, we're going to get stuck in some point. So we can't leave, right, until we've figured out what it is we're at. So in order to do that, we have to come up with a process. And as we improve the process, hopefully we're going to be able to escape. So part of this, in product development, part of the process is how are we going to ship the product? You know, when are we going to decide this thing is bait? How long is it going to take? What do we absolutely need in terms of features to push it out? Or what are some of the things that we have to hold back on? Okay, so we have to think about all these things as we decide on what our process is going to be. Now, the first time through, the process is going to be really rough, right? It might even be a concierge MVP where you don't even have a product. But let's assume you might be building something, right? You still need to have some way of saying, okay, we're going to build this, we're going to test it, we're going to ship it, we're going to get feedback, and then rinse and repeat. So one of the stories I want to tell you is that as you are building, your process is actually going to evolve. So for example, when we started at Mint, you know, it was literally just myself and Aaron, and then we had the third person, Matt. Matt did front end, I did back end, and Aaron did the design. So Aaron would literally come from his bedroom, walk into the kitchen, hand me the designs, and then hand Matt the designs, and Matt would go and make it look pretty, and I would write all the back-end code. And this is how we operated for about 6 months, right? Really great if you have a team of 3. But then as we started to mature and get bigger, we had to put a little bit more process in place. So then when we hired a VP of engineering, he came in and said, no, 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 this is all wrong, there's no security, this isn't going to scale, we have to redo the whole thing. Okay, so then we had to think about, now we've got a 4th person on the team, how do we change up the process? And then we grew from there to bringing on an actual designer, so Matt's role changed, and we had to think about how is a designer going to do the drop-off. So every time you add somebody to the team, you actually have to reevaluate your process. And one of the things to think about in this is you want to not get too hell-bent on this is the way we used to do things, right? You're going to want to change up your process as you include people, and you're going to want to think about what's their workflow, how much time do they need, and bring that also back into the complexity equation. Okay, so realize that your process is going to be very, very fluid for the first few years, possibly even 5 years or more. And that change is okay, and you kind of want to rethink how you're doing things, right? This is why we talked about having post-mortems a couple of weeks ago, so that you could reevaluate whether the process is working or it's not working. And we're just talking in the context right now of product development, but the same thing applies for customer development as well. So know that your process is going to evolve. And you should certainly expect it to. If you're doing the same thing with one person as you did with 10 people, someone's probably pissed off, or something's probably not getting done. So think about that. And even if people leave, the same thing applies, right? If someone suddenly departs on the team, and you're like, oh, what are we going to do now? Then it's probably going to be a little bit of a scramble to figure out, okay, how do we take on some of their tasks? We had a designer at BusyBee leave abruptly, but actually what we decided was instead of hiring a new designer, we would just use some off-the-shelf components. So we found something called Twitter Bootstrap, which let us just use a bunch of UI elements to build our second product. And then we didn't really need a designer for a good 6 to 8 months. So there are things that you can do even if people leave, and it doesn't have to be like, oh, it's the end of the world. So many of you have probably heard of Agile, right? And one of the things that John Quinn talks about, who's the VP of Engineering at Gilt, which I've talked to the company about before, is he says you've got to be agile in your approach to agile, right? So you can't just take somebody's process that they tell you in a book or something that you've experienced here and just immediately apply it. You're going to have to tweak it, depending on the situation. So the other thing that we need to think about in terms of complexity is scope creep, right? We've talked about this quite a lot. So the one thing that happens when we have scope creep is we can decide to do either delay the project, right? Or we can decide, hey, we're not going to delay it, we're going to ship it, and we're going to leave this particular feature or this particular story out of it. Now, the key thing you have to think about is leaving that story or that feature out going to be a detriment to the customer? Like, are they going to get pissed off? Is it going to ruin their workflow? Are they not going to understand something about the product or the feature? Or is it okay if you leave it out? So don't think of scope creep as, oh, now we've got to delay things, or, oh, we've got to include it, right? Too often people just kind of take it and assume that they have to build because it shows up, but it doesn't always have to be the case. So this is basically the Agile Manifesto, and I've highlighted here that one of the most important things in the Agile Manifesto is actually how individuals interact with each other, right? So too often we think, some of the other things, but really in order to ship something consistently, we've really got to think about all the different people who are interacting in order to ship the product. And one of the biggest issues that has come up is this idea of asynchronous workflows. So how many of you are familiar with Git or GitHub? Okay, I think everybody. So one of the things that they do in their products, and one of the reasons that they designed their product the way they have, is because they realize that teams are becoming more remote. They're realizing that not everybody works at the same time, and they realize that things just need to happen more asynchronously. And so into their product, they've actually built in a number of tools that people can use so that they can build and ship things asynchronously. So same way, in your case, in terms of how you're building your product, think about how you can do things asynchronously, where you don't necessarily have to have one person who's the bottleneck, right? Or you can still make progress with or without them, right? Too often we kind of wait for handoffs, which is a very waterfall-like method. So think about, as you're putting your process in place, how to do it. And I will ask you about your process when we do the final project. Do you have a question?
Yeah, could you talk more about asynchronous sort of method building? Because I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, so I'll give you a really simple example. One of the things that we had at BusyBee was that we all worked remotely, and sometimes we worked in different time zones, right? But a customer issue would come up, and I kind of wanted it to be solved immediately. But if every time a customer issue came up, I interrupted the engineer, then he would never get anything done, right? So we came up with this format of, we're going to post all of the requests as they come up in a queue, possibly with some priority behind them, and then it's going to be the responsibility of the engineer, when they either take breaks or at the end of the day, to review them. So now this becomes asynchronous, right? I'm not necessarily waiting for him to get back to me, as in, I'm not going to sit there and wait. I'm going to go off and do my own things. I'm going to retake in some more customer requests, or I'm going to get back to the customer and say, hey, we'll notify you in 24 to 48 hours. That's our usual pipeline, right? So I'm not over-promising anything, unless everything's crashing and burning. So we kind of create some level of hierarchy there. But in general, people don't feel like they're constantly being pushed and pulled. They can finish the tasks that they're doing.
All right, so it's basically a process that designs a queue, for instance, or something else, for work.
Exactly, yeah. So then you have to think about it more in the context of, okay, if we're going to ship this product, right, what are the key things that we have to do? Who are we waiting for? Is there some level of coordination? Or is it that we can kind of continuously ship, right? This is what Facebook does, where they've built in a really good repository of a testing suite. They have a really easy way to deploy to production anytime they want. And so they just kind of every hour push out new updates and test new features. They've got this thing called continuous deployment going on. So in that case, there's not really a bottleneck. And if something does break, it'll be picked up immediately by the test suite. So they've designed their process to handle that. Okay? Now, this isn't something that you do overnight, obviously, right? The first time you might just do, like I said, a concierge MVP, or you might put out your first product, and you literally have to put the code on the server and let it sit there, and then collect feedback from customers. But eventually, you build some automation around it. Any other questions? Okay. And then the other thing about asynchronous is it doesn't have to be necessarily just product specific, right? You can also translate it into other areas. Like you can have it apply to how you deal with customer requests or marketing requests or anything that comes in. Okay, so I think we've talked about this before, but in case I haven't, I'll mention it again. When we come up with stories, there's going to be these 3 buckets, right? We have this wistful someday bucket where if we have time and if there's a need, then someday we will build this feature. Then we've got things that are just piling up in the backlog. This might be stuff that absolutely needs to get done, but we've already got our bucket full in current, meaning what we're working on today. And so we can't pull anything off of backlog until we finish what we're working on. Now, the tool that I'm going to show you today will give you a nice visual representation of how you can tell what's in current, what's in backlog, and what's in someday. And the reason that this is great is because now everybody on the team doesn't have to go around and ask, hey, what are you working on, right? It's very obvious because you'll have some story in current that you're working on. Okay, so there's a number of tools that you can use. The one I'm going to show you guys today is Sprintly. Has anybody used Sprintly before? Okay. I think it's one of the most visually appealing ones. That's why we're going to talk about it. But we'll get to it in a second. So when we're thinking about stories, right, the first is we have to think about building the basics. We've talked about what's the infrastructure we have to put in place. And then we've talked about how do we break stories down into some basic components. How do we think about scope creep? And then we might have to reprioritize based on what's absolutely critical, right? So we think back to the mental model, the persona, and prioritize from there. And then we've talked about this format before as well, the test, ship, and then test again. So the other thing I want to mention about this queue is, obviously it's unsorted, so you don't have to sit here and prioritize the someday queue, right? Because it's someday. We'll worry about that when that happens. But what you're going to want to prioritize are the things in backlog. And the reason you're going to want to prioritize them is because once someone's finished what they're working on in current, then they're going to pull something off of backlog. This is also a great way to once again become asynchronous, where you don't have people sitting there twiddling their thumbs like, oh, I don't know what to do next. You're like, did you go look in backlog? Right? It kind of keeps people's coffers full, not saying they have to work endlessly, but it makes it a lot easier to figure out, what needs to happen next. So the most important thing in this process is to sit down, figure out what the time frame is, whether it's once a month or twice a month, and sit down as a team and, of course, prioritize these stories. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys an example of Sprintly. So you see here I've got my backlog, and then I've got my current, and then I've got completed. And I only put one story in here. So then, like I said, they've also got some cool visualizations where I can see, hey, there's one story in progress. Now, you'll also see up here this graph. As you're using it, you'll actually be able to see, as a team, how well you're all performing. And the reason that this is cool is because then you can start to see, hey, we're all sort of working collectively. We're all finishing about 5 stories a week or 2 stories a week or whatever it is, right? And then what that lets you do is then make predictions, right, for the future, where you can say, okay, it seems like on average we're completing 3 stories a week. So going forward, that's a fairly safe bet that we're going to be able to finish 3 stories, depending, of course, on complexity.
What happens when you have stories of different size? Do you just try to break them down to stories that are exactly the same size? Because that seems like very, very difficult, Especially if problems have to be researched in order to be solved.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. So there are two factors here. You are going to try to break down the story as much as possible, but let's assume we broke it down to like the very, very basic, right? Where we're now working on entering a way to tell if a password is really strong. Okay, let's assume that that's what we're working on. Well, in that case, then we're going to want to create some estimates for how difficult we think it is. So this will actually factor in not only the story itself, but what the complexity was of the story. And so the other thing it'll do is, let's say you said, oh, this story is a 5. Well, if you deliver it really quickly, then it's possible that it actually wasn't a 5 and you misestimated, and it will tell you.
Do you change that at that point in time?
Hmm?
Do you change the value of the story at that
You
point
don't
in
need
time?
to. I mean, you'll still think of it as a 5-point story, a really high, but it'll start to tell you what your volatility is.
Okay.
And by that it means where you estimated and then what you actually delivered. So it gives you a sense of how good are you at estimating the stories and the complexity of each story. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I wanted to show you was, let's say we want to do a new story. So we're going to add an item. And see here, it's already got this nice sentence structure where you can say, you know, what it is that you want to do. And then you can also categorize it based on, is this a story versus a task, where a task might be, hey, I need to call Anna today, right? You know, 1 point, but you can keep track of maybe how many of these like tasks you're doing, and that's why you're not able to ship things on time. So this is a good way to keep metrics of that. Or if this is a defect, right? It's not a story, we had already built it, we're going to go back and then add a defect to it, and then we can keep track of our defect count this way. Or, you know, we're doing some sort of test on a particular story, or we need to build some tests, so let's add that, because that's also going to take time, right? So they've sort of thought about all the different scenarios that you're going to need when you're building. Okay, so let's go here and somebody tell me a story that they want to build.
As a runner, I want to keep track of time that I've run so that I can exercise more healthfully. I'm just making stuff up.
Sure. Okay.
This is not related to us.
Okay. And then if you wanted, you could actually add more files. If you had a screenshot, if you had a mock-up, you can add all of that here. And then you can also assign it to somebody. So let's go ahead and assign it to me. And it's going to go ahead and create the story. So when it creates the story, right, it's been added to someday. So it's not, here I've got backlog, current, and complete. I don't have someday. So I'm going to go view the item, and let's say I have the time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click to accept the story. Okay, so I'm going to say move it to current, or you know, let's leave it in someday, or let's put it in backlog. Actually, let's put it in backlog. Okay. Now if I go back to my dashboard, I'll see here, I don't know why it's not showing up there. They have an issue. Anyways, but you see here that there's one story in backlog, one story in progress, right? And then if I complete this last story that I did, it's going to go ahead and show up in the completed, and then see where it says accept or reject? The reason that you're doing that, oh look, it showed up there. The reason that you do that is if you've got people testing it, right? You might say, hey, my stories are done, and then someone's going to be like, hey, I just tested that story. There's a bug in it. I'm filing a bug, and I'm rejecting your story. And it goes back into your current. You got it? Okay? So see, this is like a good workflow for keeping track of what you're doing, also keeping up to date on what people are doing. Okay? So then I might have fixed it, and then I say, okay, now it is complete. Right? Hopefully this doesn't create like a war between the current and the complete.
Hashtag won't fix.
Yeah. Okay? So do people understand this sprintly? Okay. I know that there's more things that you can do, but I'm just going to leave it at this simple demonstration. Okay. So we just talked a little bit about bugs, right? These are going to pop up as well. They're going to happen no matter what. Now, the key thing is evaluating whether this bug is a showstopper, meaning you can't ship, or, hey, you know, let's leave it in there, or, you know, the classic, this isn't a bug, this is a feature, right? Whatever it is. be sure to document it, right? Go ahead and put it in the backlog for people to know that it exists. Okay, so coming back now to what we talked about, the reason that we want to factor in all of the bugs or all of the feedback that we get after we've shipped is because there may come a time where we decide in our product roadmap it doesn't make sense to introduce any new features, right? Because we've got enough people who are either pissed off with the current product that if we just build more stuff, it's just going to keep piling on, and we might actually need to do an iteration, or we might need to have a month where all we're doing is fixing what we've built. Okay? So I know many of you in your roadmaps, right, we talked about this when you got up here and did your exercises, you had sort of month 1, 2, 3, 4, and it had like 6 months. But a lot of times what will happen is either those 6 months will actually be 9 or 12 months of work, or within some of those months you'll have to take some breaks to refine what it is that you did, right, based on the feedback you get from customers. So remember to factor that in as well. So we just talked about this, understand your speed. So hopefully with using a tool like Sprintly, you get a sense of what your personal cadence is, right, whether you're estimating stories correctly or incorrectly. But you also need to understand, like I said, overall what's the team's speed. So how quickly is everybody working? And one of the things that I've seen some teams do is not only apply this to engineering, but to marketing and biz dev and everything else like that. I actually talked to the VP of GitHub this morning, and he was telling me how he actually uses GitHub for business stuff. Like he will, look up his business documents on a GitHub repo. So kind of interesting. But my point being, everybody's kind of using the same tools in the organization, and you're able to measure progress as a group, especially when you're small. Okay. So in order to ship product, right, we have to come up with a process. Part of that process initially is going to be kind of rough, but the other things that we need to think about are not only iterating on the product, right, so how does this fit back into the business, we have to think about how are we going to possibly raise capital for this or make money. How are we going to scale customer acquisition, right? We might have 10 customers, how do we get to 100? What's the feedback we've gotten from customers? And then going on to growing the team as well as building a sustainable business. So this is just one component. Shipping product is just one component, but there are many other things that are involved here. Okay, so I just want to highlight that as well. So coming back then to what it is that we're building, when we talk about the stories, this is why we have to relate it back to the feature and then relate the feature back to the business goal, right? What's the basic value proposition of what we're building? So a lot of what you want to think as you're creating your features is, does what we're building not only factor into the product itself, but factor into any of these other things that we're doing, right? So don't always think that everything that we do has to be product-centric. Right? There might come a time where your team grows so much that you're actually going to have to put in a training program or an onboarding process where they're all going to need to learn how to use the tools or understand the code base. And so you're going to need to factor that in as well as you still continue to ship. Okay?